At 67 years old, Ruth Williams had lived through a lifetime of hardship. She had witnessed the injustice and the struggles that come with being a black woman in America. She had seen discrimination, faced adversity, and weathered more than her fair share of storms. But after decades of survival, she believed that her golden years would be different, that at last, she could find peace, comfort, and dignity. And why wouldn't she? After all, she had earned it. But on this particular day, she went to the hospital with what she thought would be just another routine visit. Something small, something temporary. A place designed to heal, to provide care, to offer relief. A place she thought she could trust. What she didn't expect was that this hospital, this place that was supposed to offer care, would become the very source of humiliation and intimidation. And it wasn't just the hospital that failed her. It was the nurse. The very person who was supposed to ensure her well-being, who, instead, made her feel less than human. Ruth, already vulnerable, already a woman of her age, became the target of a treatment she had not earned, a treatment that should never happen to anyone, anywhere. In this moment, she faced something she had not expected to encounter again in her lifetime: blatant racism. A form of cruelty hidden beneath the guise of professionalism. It was a cruelty designed to strip her of her dignity. But Ruth, she didn't let it define her. She refused to be broken, refused to stay silent, and refused to let that moment of humiliation be the final chapter of her story. This is the story of how one woman, at 67 years old, stood up and found her voice once again. In the face of injustice, in the face of discrimination, Ruth Williams found a way to stand strong. And in doing so, she reminded us all that no matter how old we are, no matter the odds, we can choose to fight for what's right, even when the world tries to tell us we don't matter. As we reflect on this real-life story, subscribe to this channel and don't forget to turn on your notification for more daily stories that need to be heard. Hit the subscribe button now and let us know your thought on this story. Meet Ruth Williams, a grandmother, a mother, a woman who has weathered the storms of life with unshakable resolve. Ruth grew up during the Civil Rights Movement, a time when Black Americans were still fighting for their basic rights, their right to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with the dignity that all people deserve. She lived through the pain of segregation, the struggles of equality, and the constant battle against injustice. Yet, Ruth was never one to bow to the weight of the world's prejudice. Instead, she pressed forward, as determined as the day she first took a stand. She was no stranger to hardship. She had faced doors closed in her face, had fought battles both big and small, always pushing for fairness, for opportunity, for justice. As a mother, she fought for her children's future. As a grandmother, she fought for the future of her family, to make sure they never had to endure what she did. Throughout it all, Ruth held onto a deep belief that things could get better, that change was possible, and that one person, no matter their age, could make a difference. By the time she entered her golden years, she hoped for peace. She had earned it, after all. A time to reflect, to enjoy her family, and perhaps, to find the rest she had longed for. She thought she would be free from the daily battles that had marked so much of her life. But, like so many who have lived through great struggle, Ruth knew that peace is often fleeting, and sometimes, even in the most unexpected places, the fight continues. She had been here before. Hospitals were a familiar place, a part of her life, as they are for so many. She had been a patient more times than she could count, navigating medical appointments, treatments, and procedures. But this visit felt different. She wasn't just here for a routine checkup or a minor issue. She was here because her body was beginning to show signs of wear, signs of aging that she could no longer ignore. And so, like anyone seeking help, Ruth came to the place that was supposed to provide answers, comfort, and care. But as she sat in that sterile, white hospital room, Ruth had no idea that what awaited her was not the treatment she had hoped for, but something far more troubling. The hospital, this place of healing, would soon become the setting for an encounter that would test her in ways she had not anticipated. She had seen discrimination before, heard the hurtful words, faced the closed doors, and had fought tirelessly for the respect that every person deserves. But at 67 years old, Ruth had not expected to find herself facing something she thought she had left behind. She had hoped that in these later years, she would be treated with the dignity she had earned, by everyone, including those who had taken an oath to care for the vulnerable. Ruth had always fought for her dignity, always demanded to be seen for who she truly was, not just her age, not just her race, but as a person with a lifetime of experiences and a strong sense of self. Hospitals were supposed to be safe spaces. They were places where people came for help, for healing. She had trusted this hospital, this system, to provide just that. She trusted that the people here, people like Nurse Kelly, would understand this basic truth. That every person who walks through these doors deserves respect, no matter their background or age. As she waited, unaware of what was coming, she had no way of knowing that the quiet expectation of being treated with kindness and respect was about to be shattered. What Ruth didn't yet realize was that this hospital, this place that had long been a symbol of healing, was about to become the scene of something far darker. And in the process, Ruth's courage, resilience, and sense of justice would once again be tested. But in this moment of calm, Ruth couldn't have known that the journey she thought she was embarking on, the one toward healing, would soon take a sharp turn. The struggle that had defined so much of her life, the fight against unfairness, against prejudice, was not over. Not by a long shot. Nurse Kelly entered the room without a word of greeting, her eyes fixed on her clipboard as though Ruth was nothing more than a set of numbers and symptoms to her. She didn't offer Ruth a smile, nor did she introduce herself, something that would have been expected of anyone in her position. The lack of warmth, the absence of basic courtesy, hung heavily in the air. Ruth, already on edge from her health concerns, tried to maintain her composure. She had seen many nurses and doctors over the years, and she knew the drill. But there was something about Nurse Kelly's energy that felt off. It began like any other hospital visit. Ruth, needing help for a health issue that was becoming too serious to ignore, arrived at the hospital with a quiet sense of hope. She thought this would be like any other visit. Routine, straightforward. After all, a hospital was a place for healing, wasn't it? So, you're here for what exactly? Are you sure you need this? We're really busy today. You should have come in earlier, Nurse Kelly said dismissively, not looking up from the chart. At first, Ruth wasn't sure what to make of it. It was a busy hospital day, after all. Maybe the nurse was just tired. Maybe this was just an off moment. Ruth understood that people had bad days. But there was something about Nurse Kelly's tone that rubbed her the wrong way. It wasn't just impatience, it was dismissiveness. Ruth had dealt with enough in her lifetime to recognize the difference. Nurse Kelly rolls her eyes as she flips through the chart, not once looking up from the paper. She barely acknowledges Ruth, as if she's just another name on the list. Honestly, you should have come in earlier. We don't have time to waste on people who aren't urgent. I'm really not sure this is necessary, but whatever, I guess we'll get it done. Ruth had heard worse in her life, racial slurs, insults based on her age. But this wasn't just rude, this felt different. Nurse Kelly wasn't just speaking to her as a patient, she was treating her like an inconvenience. Ruth had spent her entire life fighting to be seen as more than just a stereotype. She had been an activist during the civil rights movement, a mother, a grandmother, and a survivor of countless battles. But now, at 67, she found herself on the receiving end of disrespect in a place that was supposed to care for her. And it hit hard. Look, we don't have time for this. Maybe I should just get someone else to explain it to you. You know, someone your age might be more comfortable with this. Nurse Kelly said curtly. This was no longer just about a medical issue. Ruth wasn't just asking for help, she was being made to feel small. Invisible. The nurse wasn't just ignoring her concerns, she was belittling her. Ruth's entire life had been a battle for dignity and respect. And here she was, at the mercy of a nurse who didn't see her as a person, but as a burden. As if her voice didn't matter. Don't worry about it, I'll get you someone else if I have to, but I don't have time for this right now. Nurse Kelly snapped. For a moment, Ruth felt a familiar wave of doubt. Could she just let it go? After all, it was just one nurse. She'd faced so much in her life, maybe it wasn't worth confronting. But deep down, Ruth knew that this wasn't about just this nurse, it was about something much bigger. It was about respect, it was about fairness, it was about the right to be heard, to be treated with dignity, no matter how old you are, no matter your race. I'm not asking for much. I just want to be treated like anyone else who comes in here. I want respect. I'm not here to be belittled. Ruth said with quiet strength. Nurse Kelly looks up for the first time, and for a brief moment, there's a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She doesn't say anything, just glances at Ruth, still holding her clipboard. Ruth holds her gaze, unflinching. Ruth wasn't going to back down. She had lived through too much to let anyone strip her of her dignity. She wasn't going to let this nurse's cold attitude become her reality. Ruth had fought all her life, for her voice, for her rights, for respect. She wasn't going to stop now, not even in a hospital bed. It wasn't just about one rude nurse. Ruth knew that. She had faced enough hardship to recognize the quiet forms of disrespect that slipped by unnoticed. But she also knew that standing up for herself meant something. It wasn't just for her. It was for every person, every patient, who had ever been made to feel like they didn't matter. And Ruth wasn't about to let that happen. In that room, at that moment, Ruth wasn't just a patient in a hospital. She was a woman who had fought for justice her whole life, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget it. She had lived through enough to know that speaking up was important. So, when she felt uncertain about the treatment plan, she asked the nurse for clarity. It was a simple question, one any patient would have asked. She was not asking for special treatment, just a basic level of care and understanding. But Nurse Kelly wasn't having it. What Ruth had hoped would be an ordinary interaction, a conversation between patient and nurse, quickly turned into something much darker. The nurse's response, laced with a quiet contempt, made it clear this was not about answering questions. It was about making Ruth feel small. And Nurse Kelly didn't even try to hide it. She looks up from the file, her lips curling into a mocking smile. She looks down at Ruth, and for a moment, it feels as if she is seeing Ruth for the first time. Not as a patient, but as someone unworthy of respect. Nurse Kelly, without missing a beat, began to mock Ruth's request. What was supposed to be a simple medical exchange was now a public humiliation. Ruth's heart sank as the nurse's tone shifted. This wasn't just an offhand comment. This was deliberate. Ruth could feel it, deep down. The way the nurse's words aimed to diminish her, to make her feel irrelevant. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way they were said, loud enough for the other staff in the room to hear, just enough to make Ruth feel embarrassed, exposed. It was as if she was a joke, a spectacle. She leans in slightly, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she glances up from Ruth's chart. Well, I'm sure someone like you doesn't understand the medical jargon. Maybe I should just get you someone, your age, to explain it. Ruth flinches, her face falling for a moment. The words cut deeper than she was prepared for. The air in the room feels colder, sharper now. She opens her mouth to respond but quickly closes it. Instead, her hands tighten into fists in her lap, the knuckles turning white. She knows she has been insulted, and it stings more than it should, but she refuses to let it show. She had fought for respect her entire life. She had weathered the storms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice. She had learned to stand tall in the face of ignorance, to not let the hateful words of others chip away at her sense of self. But here, in this sterile, cold room, surrounded by white walls and the soft hum of medical equipment, she was being humiliated in front of others. And it hurt, deeply. The mocking tone, the way Nurse Kelly had reduced her to nothing more than a stereotype, was not just offensive, it was personal. It was the kind of pain that Ruth had spent decades trying to move beyond. The kind of pain that had defined too many moments in her life. Yet, despite the sting, Ruth refused to let the nurse see her break. She had learned long ago that no one had the right to take her dignity from her. Not her classmates, not the people who looked down on her during the civil rights movement, and certainly not a nurse in a hospital room. She had fought too hard, endured too much, to let this moment define her. But in that instant, she felt the weight of years of disrespect and ignorance, all boiling to the surface. But Ruth was not going to let it consume her. Not now, not ever. In that moment, Ruth made a decision. This was no longer just about the nurse. It was about something larger. It was about the principle that no one, no matter their position, no matter their role in society, had the right to strip away her dignity. Not in a hospital, not anywhere. Ruth had spent too many years learning how to stand her ground, how to refuse to be broken, and this nurse would not be the one to make her feel small again. She had made it through so much in her life, and no nurse, no matter how cruel, would make her feel like she was nothing. She had fought too long for her voice to be ignored, and this nurse, for all her arrogance, would soon learn that Ruth's spirit could not be diminished so easily. Ruth didn't need to shout. She didn't need to argue. She just needed to hold her ground, to remind herself, and the nurse, that she was worthy of respect. And that was a fight Ruth knew how to win. But Ruth wasn't going to be intimidated. She wasn't going to let one moment of cruelty define the rest of her day or her life. No, this was just another chapter in a story that Ruth knew all too well, one that was shaped by resilience. A story of standing up, not backing down, and demanding the respect she knew she deserved. Ruth had been through enough to know that the only way to keep her dignity intact was to fight for it. And that's exactly what she intended to do. Ruth takes a deep breath, looking over at the door where Nurse Kelly exited. Her grip tightens on the edge of her blanket, and her expression hardens with quiet determination. She looks up and calls out, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, I would like to speak with someone else." "Please," she said steadily. There was no anger in Ruth's voice. There was no shouting or demands. But there was strength. Ruth wasn't asking for something unreasonable. She was simply asking for the respect that every patient is entitled to. And that, in itself, was a powerful act of resistance. She had made her voice heard. She had said enough was enough. Now, all she had to do was wait. Ruth wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. A few moments pass. The soft sound of footsteps grows louder, and a new figure enters the room. This time, it is a different nurse, one who carries herself with calm professionalism. She steps into the room, her expression warm and open, the contrast to Nurse Kelly immediately noticeable. After what felt like an eternity, a different nurse stepped in, this one with kindness in her eyes. She immediately noticed Ruth's demeanor, her posture, the subtle but unmistakable tension in the room. And unlike Nurse Kelly, this nurse's first instinct was to listen, to understand. Ruth didn't have to explain herself, this nurse saw it immediately. She understood that something was wrong, and she didn't question it. She simply acted. The nurse approaches Ruth with a soft smile, her voice gentle but full of sincerity. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Williams. That's not how we treat patients here. I'm going to get this taken care of right away." Ruth, still sitting in her bed, nods slowly. Her gaze softens, but there is no smile. The anger she felt earlier has now settled into something quieter, something more reflective. She holds the nurse's gaze, not with suspicion, but with a quiet sense of gratitude for the recognition of her dignity. Though the damage had been done, Ruth's courage had sparked something else, something that went beyond the interaction with Nurse Kelly. Ruth hadn't just stood up for herself, she had reminded herself that her voice mattered. That she, too, had the power to demand the treatment she deserved. She wasn't just a victim of an isolated incident. She was part of a larger story. A story of all those who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. A story that stretched back decades. But now, for Ruth, this moment wasn't just about one nurse or one moment of humiliation. It was about reclaiming the power to speak, to be heard, and to assert that she would never, under any circumstances, be silenced again. Ruth sits back in her bed, her expression now quiet but resolute. Her eyes are focused, looking beyond the nurse, beyond the room, to something larger. There's no visible sign of weakness, no trace of defeat. She's still processing the event, but there's an undeniable strength radiating from her. Ruth's story was about more than just one interaction. It was about all the little injustices that went unnoticed for too long. The moments when people were made to feel invisible because of their age, their race, their gender, or their socioeconomic status. These were the quiet indignities that had been allowed to accumulate over time, unchallenged. But Ruth knew that every voice mattered. Every person had the right to be heard. And in that moment, she had shown herself, and everyone around her, that she would stand firm. She would not accept less than what was rightfully hers. And so Ruth stood, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel invisible. She wasn't just a patient in a bed. She was a woman who knew her worth, who understood the power of her voice, and who would never again allow anyone to take that from her. In a world that often overlooked people like Ruth, older, black, female, she would no longer be just another face in the crowd. She was someone who demanded respect, someone who refused to be overlooked. Ruth's story is not unique. What happened to her in that hospital room, being dismissed, belittled, and disregarded, has happened far too many times before. In fact, research shows that black patients are more likely to receive poor treatment in healthcare settings. Studies have found that discrimination, bias, and microaggressions are not only present, they are rampant. For many, the experience of going to a hospital is not just about seeking care, but about enduring a system that too often makes them feel invisible. And worse, it can cost lives. Every day, Black patients enter hospitals, clinics, and doctors' offices expecting to be treated with care and compassion. Yet, far too often, their pain is minimized. Their questions are ignored. Their concerns are dismissed. For Black people, these aren't just isolated experiences. They're the reality of navigating a healthcare system that was never built with their needs in mind. It's a system where the color of your skin can dictate how you are treated. Where a simple visit for treatment can turn into an ordeal of humiliation and neglect. Ruth's experience in that hospital room was a catalyst, but it was not the first time she had faced such treatment. And it won't be the last. But Ruth's courage to stand up, to say, enough, sparked something much larger. She knew she wasn't just fighting for herself. Her voice, strong as it was, represented the voices of countless others, those who had suffered quietly, too afraid or too defeated to speak out. Ruth wasn't just standing up to one nurse. She was standing up to a system that had for too long been allowed to dehumanize and marginalize people like her. Ruth's courage wasn't just about standing up to one nurse. It was about exposing a much deeper issue, one that affects millions of people across the country. It was about a system that continues to marginalize people of color, particularly in healthcare. Ruth understood that the fight wasn't just about one moment, one incident. It was about making sure that the voices of those who had been silenced for so long were finally heard. Ruth knew that one person alone could not change a system this entrenched. But Ruth also knew that one voice could start a movement. And Ruth's voice was now joined by others who had faced the same hardships, the same injustices. People who were ready to fight, to demand the changes that were so desperately needed. Ruth wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for a generation of people who had been treated as less than, ignored, or overlooked. It was clear that Ruth's courage was beginning to make waves. It was clear that her story was no longer just hers to tell. It was the story of millions of people who had been mistreated, who had been denied equal care, who had suffered in silence. But now, those voices were being heard. And Ruth's voice, her steadfast refusal to be silenced, was at the forefront of this change. This was just the beginning. Ruth's story, though personal, was now part of a larger movement for justice, for equality in healthcare, for the voices of the marginalized to be heard. Ruth had lit a fire, and that fire was beginning to spread, sparking change not just in one hospital room, but across a healthcare system that had for too long turned a blind eye to the suffering of so many. Change was coming, and it was being driven by the courage of individuals like Ruth, who had the strength to speak up, to demand better, and to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had. Ruth's fight didn't end in that hospital room. It wasn't just about one interaction, one nurse, or one moment. It was about something far larger, something Ruth had been confronting her entire life. That day in the hospital was just another chapter in a long history of standing up, of refusing to be diminished, of insisting on her humanity. But for Ruth, this wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unvalued. And it was a fight she wasn't going to back away from. For Ruth, the support of her family was everything. They were her anchor, her reason for fighting, and her strength when things felt too heavy to bear. They had watched her endure so much over the years, had seen her confront injustice time and time again, and they knew she would not stop now. They didn't just see her as a grandmother, a mother, or an elder. They saw her as a fighter, as someone who stood tall even when the world tried to push her down. And now, as she stood among them, their pride in her was unmistakable. But Ruth knew that what happened inside that hospital wasn't just about her. It was a reflection of a system that had for too long allowed bias, discrimination, and neglect to fester unchecked. Ruth wasn't naive. She knew change wouldn't come overnight. But she also knew that change wouldn't come at all unless people like her stood up and demanded it. She understood that her voice, though powerful, needed to be part of a larger chorus calling for justice, for equity, for the kind of care that every person deserves, no matter their race, age, or background. She understood that the fight for justice in healthcare wasn't just her fight, it was a fight that involved all of us. It was about changing a system that had for too long failed those who needed it most. It was about holding institutions accountable, about recognizing and addressing the biases that had been allowed to persist, and about ensuring that no one else would have to endure the kind of treatment Ruth faced that day. Ruth's courage was the spark, But the fire that followed was fueled by countless others who had experienced the same indignities, the same injustices. Together, their voices began to rise, their stories began to be told, and the walls of silence that had long protected the status quo began to crack. Change was no longer just a distant hope, it was becoming a movement. And Ruth's story was at the heart of it all. Her journey wasn't over. She knew the road ahead would be long, and the obstacles would be many. But Ruth also knew that change was possible. She had seen it before, had fought for it before, and she was ready to fight for it again. Her story, though deeply personal, was now part of something much larger, a collective fight for dignity, respect, and equality in healthcare. It was a fight that Ruth believed in with every fiber of her being. Ruth's story reminds us that every voice matters. Together, we can change the system. Stand up, speak out, join the fight for justice in healthcare. This fight belongs to all of us. The healthcare system can change, but only if we demand it. Ruth showed us the power of one voice. Imagine what we can do together. She stands surrounded by love. Her family, her foundation, are there to support her, to remind her that she's not alone. She's faced many battles in her life, some won, some lost, but this fight for justice in healthcare is different. It's not just about one woman standing up against the mistreatment she endured, it's about all of us. All of us coming together to challenge a system that has been broken for far too long. So, what will you do when you witness injustice? When you see someone being treated unfairly, when you hear someone's voice being silenced, what choice will you make? Will you stay silent, or will you speak up? Will you stand by, or will you stand up? Ruth's story reminds us that change isn't easy, but it is possible. It starts with the courage to do what's right, even when no one else is watching. It starts with the willingness to be the voice for those who can't speak for themselves. It's time to demand better. It's time to hold those in power accountable. It's time to make sure every person who walks into a hospital, every person who seeks care, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. Together, we can build a healthcare system that serves everyone equally, no matter their race, age, or background. But to do that, we need to speak out. We need to make our voices heard. It starts with us. And it starts now.